Capita envisions a future in which families and communities can flourish. By prioritizing families and their communities, we have the potential to radically transform the fabric of our societies for the long term. In this series of Capita In Conversation, we talk to interviewees from around the world to hear their stories, knowledge, wisdom, and ideas on how to craft effective policies for a future in which families and their communities can flourish. In this extended episode, Deb Chachra, materials scientist and professor of engineering, explores the profound connections between care and infrastructure in our society. Infrastructure systems are ways we take care of each other at scale. This conversation challenges us to rethink how we value and sustain the systems that underpin our lives.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joe Waters, co-founder and CEO of Capita, and I'm delighted to be with my guest today. Deb, it is so great to have you here on the Capita In Conversation podcast. I'm delighted to be able to have this conversation after so many years of following your work. In 2017, in The Atlantic, and what I think was the first essay of yours I ever read, you said, when we think about caring for our neighbors, we think about local churches and charities, systems embedded in our communities. But I see these technological systems as one of the main ways that we take care of each other at scale. It's how Americans care for all 300 million of our neighbors, rich or poor, spread over 4 million square miles, embedded in global supply chains. And I think what struck me about that is the word care, that infrastructure is an act of care. Tell us more about what you meant.
So I deeply believe that the systems are ways in which we're connected to each other. And so whether that's things like food safety, where they're very explicitly to help keep people from getting sick, whether it's things like the electrical grid, things like water systems, right? These all have their roots in the realization that we could build systems that actually can take care of all of us, and that it makes economic sense to do so, that it makes social sense to do so. I'm an engineer, so I think about it sort of energy and matter sense to do so. But we think about these as systems that are primarily economic or primarily technological, we kind of really miss the point, right? The point is that they are replacing the work that we've done to take care of each other, and they enable us to take care in many ways of everyone. So things like clean water. And by doing so, that enables us to give us individually freedom to go and do other things in the world. But it's one of those things where we take infrastructure so much for granted. I mean, I actually think we also take caregiving for granted, and particularly gendered labor. And it becomes like all forms of caregiving, it becomes incredibly apparent when it isn't working. It's interesting because I think that, everyone talks about how infrastructure becomes most visible on failure. And that really is an excellent connection in which the same way, in the sense in which it's care, right? They're both most visible when they're not present.
One of the things that has excited me about your work is that it sort of exists at the nexus of at least three major areas of our own work, which is care and caregiving, social connection and social infrastructure, solidarity, we call it, and the impacts of climate change. When you think about all of these together, we're living through, some people like to talk about it as a polycrisis or a crisis of care, the climate crisis, so forth. I think I'm moving more in the direction of we're living through an age of transitions. I'm just curious, like, how do you think in this moment, in this context, with all these things together, how do you think about the infrastructure that we need to be building or the infrastructure that we need to be maintaining, and how we might both do that and sort of think about it, but also do it practically, invest in it, and so forth?
I just want to say I really love that you highlighted solidarity, because I very much think of sort of empathy and connections are about putting yourself in other people's shoes, of thinking about sort of people who are like you. And I am definitely someone who prefers to think about it in terms of solidarity, which is to stand beside people who you understand are not like you, that might have very different needs, might have very different values, very different ways of living. And that really gets at an important point. And, you quoted me as saying these are systems of how we take care of all 300 million of us. And that really is solidarity, right? It is recognizing the connection, but it's about realizing that depending on where you live, your needs and your values might be very, very different. And one of the things about sort of thinking about these systems and investing in these systems is that it's an act of solidarity as well as an act of care. So, to your point, I feel that there's a few sort of things to sort of lay as sort of ground pieces. So one is the climate disruption piece, right? I really love Superflux, the design firm. They're based in London. John Arden has this idea that the climate transition is a predicament to be navigated. It's not a thing that we're going to stop or just respond to. It's going to be sort of an ongoing process of navigation. And one of the reasons why I really like that metaphor is because I really think that there is a far shore we're trying to get to. And the far shore is not just that we stop climate change. It's not even just that we decarbonize. It's that by transitioning to renewable energy, we have access to energy that it's the just energy transition, right? This idea that we'll have access to energy that will be really sort of economically unprecedented in human history. So pretty much we've only ever gotten significant amounts of energy by setting things on fire, right? That was what fossil fuels really enabled 150 or so years ago, is getting energy at sort of enormous scale by doing that. And that's what we built our world on. There are notable exceptions, and exceptions are things like hydroelectricity, which use a renewable resource. And one of the things that sort of falls out of that is hydroelectricity is noticeably cheaper than other forms of electricity because you need to pay for the operating costs and you need to pay for the distribution, but you don't have to pay kind of on a per joule basis for the energy. And the real potential to me of renewable energy is that all energy then will operate in that kind of economic scheme, right? That all energy, you don't have to pay for, I said one, but it's really more like sort of 4 or 5 joules of energy for every joule of energy that you use. And I think of it as sort of the difference between, if you drive a car, as soon as you turn the ignition or push the button to start the car, you start paying for the gas that's powering it. But if you have a bike, you pay for the operating costs of the bike, but you don't actually have to pay directly for the energy that you use, right? You just get on your bike and go. And so if all energy behaves like hydroelectricity, that really changes the sort of economics around it, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is just the realization that renewable energy is not scarce, that it in fact is incredibly abundant, right? That if all humans used energy at the rate of North Americans, it's still a fraction of a percent of the solar energy that's arriving on our planet. So we're used to thinking of renewable energy as a scarce resource, but in fact, it's fossil fuels that are scarce. So what we're looking at is the sort of next big jump in available energy. So the first big jump was kind of straight to fossil fuels. Like in all of human history, we used more or less the same amount of energy until fossil fuels came around. And then we've seen this exponential growth and we're living in the consequences of the exponential growth. But now we're looking at the possibility of another big jump, and that jump is to use renewables, to not get energy by passing through setting things on fire, by passing through matter. But that actually raises sort of the other point, which is that when we talk about dealing with the environment, the other piece of it is that the Earth is a closed system for matter. So everything that we dig out of the ground and then transform and use and move somewhere else to where we use it, and then dump it, pretty much, right? Still has to go somewhere. So CO2 in the atmosphere is the most obvious example of that. But it's, microplastics in the ocean, it's anything in landfill, right? This is just this idea of you're taking matter and you're moving it, you're doing stuff to it, and then it's ending up someplace else. And that, when we got access to large amounts of energy, that's the thing that we really supercharged, right? We're going to extract matter, we're going to do something with it, and we're going to dump it. And I like to use aluminum as an example because aluminum requires an enormous amount of energy to make. It actually was enabled in part by access to hydroelectricity. But it was literally precious when we first figured out how to refine aluminum metal. But now, of course, it's quite literally disposable, right? And there's every possibility that you or anyone listening has used and thrown away some aluminum foil this morning. So the catch is that if we use the renewable energy and if we use the new economics of renewable energy to do the same thing we've done before, we're just going to dig ourselves into a much deeper hole. However, if we use it to do the things that haven't been economic before, that is to really close materials loops, to really do things that have been economically unfeasible, which often just means energetically unfeasible, right? Because energy is the actual currency of the material world, and that's where we all live, that it opens up a whole bunch of new possibilities. And the biggest one is the idea of remediating, of like not polluting in our environment and remediating our environment. And that's really the pathway to living within our sort of planetary boundaries. So when I think about navigating climate change, what I think about is building the world where all of our energy comes from renewable sources, and then we have access to the energy to do the things that we don't do today. Like, most importantly, making sure that everything that we use, every atom that we use, gets reused. So instead of being pulled out of the ground or dumped when we're done, we put the time and energy and technology in to use those atoms again. So I realized that was a super, super, super long introduction, right? But it's really important because the goal is not we're trying to manage human suffering or manage ecosystem issues as while dealing with climate change. The goal is to create this world where we transition to using renewable energy, and then we use that energy, one, to actually make the transition possible, right, by using these materials, but two, to really manage how we use materials, and essentially bring us sort of in alignment with the planetary reality, which is that we have sort of effectively unlimited energy, but we're a really closed system for materials. So that the starting point is the goal is not just to figure out how to manage climate change. The goal is to build that world, and on the way, we'll solve climate change, right? It's just a thing that will happen kind of in the process. But the way of thinking about it is what we want to do is we want to collectively build this other world. So
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on this because this phrase "building the world," I mean, that's evocative and exciting. Yet, as our colleague Elliot Haspel often says, we could stop burning fossil fuels in the next 5 minutes,
right,
and we would still be living with the effects of having spent
correct.
150 years doing
Yep.
so. And so, like, how do you think about the sort of adaptive capacity that we need to build along with the transition to using the abundant renewable sources of energy?
Well, so the first thing that's actually sort of relevant is that everything that we build to deal with the transition is going to have an energy cost and a matter cost, right? So if we don't wrap our arms around this idea of we want to use renewable energy to build it and we actually want to deal with the material impacts of it, we're not going to be better off, right? If you can imagine taking every car off the road, every internal combustion car off the road and replacing it with an electric car, right? And you can just think about like how many cars are now have just been junked, right? And how much material we need to build the new ones. And it really sort of highlights this idea that if we haven't figured out how to reuse materials to build this world, then we're going to be in much, much deeper trouble than we are. And that I haven't even touched on sort of the energy costs of building out this new thing. So it's not unrelated, right? Having said that, that's sort of the first piece, right? That if we do this without concern for what we're making things out of, we're going to be in a much, much deeper hole than we are now. And that's why there are people, for example, working on things like green concrete, right? That doesn't actually contribute more CO2 to the atmosphere, right? So it's like if we're going to build new, physical systems and we're going to build them out of concrete, we don't want to dig ourselves deeper into the hole that we're also trying to get ourselves out of, right? So these are not unrelated questions. They're just happening at different scales. But to your question, there's sort of, one thing is just this idea of the future is, I mean, the future is always unpredictable, and there's certainly, always going to be more coming down the pike. But the idea that we need to build systems that are resilient and adaptable. And a piece of that is actually building things that make sense in local environments. So not necessarily having kind of top-down solutions. It's like, well, what do we do? How do we build it? And it's like, this is the thing that is absolutely going to happen on a sort of block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, house by house scale. And in fact, you sort of see that in the US, you see that in the funding mechanism. So the Inflation Reduction Act and the Build Back Better Act are really sort of scaled not, the sort of New Deal, build giant dams in the desert to get energy, but to give communities access to energy, access to funds to do what makes sense in their community. So I know someone who lives on an island off the coast of Washington State. And, they use that funding to get an electric ferry instead to replace their old diesel ferry. So it's like, they had the money for the capital investment and it will save them. It's obviously cleaner, it works better, it will save them money in the future, and it's decarbonized. And, I just heard Pete Buttigieg on 99% Invisible, and he says there's been 55,000 grants of this sort that have been made, which I have to say was like a solid order of magnitude. So one, piece of this is this idea of like using the resources, using federal resources to allow people to make individual decisions about what makes sense for their community. That it's not the thing that the federal government can do really well is give you the money to do what you want to do. The thing that communities can do really well is figure out what is the thing that makes the most sense for their community. So that's a piece of it. Another piece of it is because we're at the beginning of this transition and we're still figuring out what it's going to look like, the idea of not thinking like we know we have 100-year solutions, right? That understanding that whatever we want to build it at a scale and in a way that we understand is somewhat contingent, right? The possibility of doing things better in the future. And so that might be making things physically small. That might mean understanding that we're going to make a thing, but we're going to revisit it in a relatively short time frame. So possibly in the sort of 10 or 20-year time frame instead of it's going to last for 100 years, because I think we're all a little bit unsure about what our landscapes are going to be looking like in 100 years. So this on the one hand, this is a real shift, right? To think about infrastructure not in the sort of monolithic top-down, we're just going to build these huge things way, but to think of it as something that is sort of contingent and responsive, that is intended to be like, well, we know we're at the beginning of this transition, so we're not going to lock ourselves in to ways of doing things. And it's funny, I live in an apartment that was built in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that was built in the 1870s or so. And even in my apartment today, there are a bunch of different types of electrical outlets and the sort of residue of the days when they weren't fully standardized, right?
Yeah.
That people were sort of figuring out like what kind of electrical outlet makes the most sense in different applications. And we're sort of doing that on a very large scale. So that's the thing that I think about that really sort of lends itself to things like decentralization, right? To have distribution. It doesn't really lend itself to sort of centralized things. So like when we think of sort of climate mitigation, we often think about things to like, well, that will manage kind of flooding or that will manage drought or will store water, right? Those kinds of things. And I just want to be clear that what we're actually talking about is everything that we would kind of identify as sort of infrastructural, particularly utilities, right? Because all of these are networks, all these things I think of as, water, sewage, electricity, fuel, transportation, all of these are embedded in the landscape. They all either move us around or they move things to where we use them, right? And so the thing that's happening is that landscape is changing, right? So this isn't just, oh, you need to figure out how to do flood mitigation in your neighborhood. This is, you really kind of need to rethink all kinds of infrastructure where you live. When we talk about natural disasters, right, we kind of measure the severity of a natural disaster by like what infrastructural systems went down and how hard, right? As people in Western North Carolina, of course, are dealing with on a daily basis. Like, did you lose your water? Did you lose your electricity? Did you lose your transportation links and the like? So there's kind of there's no sort of pathway to addressing climate impacts and the effect it has on people without going through our infrastructural networks, right? Without making them more resilient, whether that's in the short term to deal with sort of climate impacts, or whether it's in the long term to deal with the fact that our landscapes are shifting. So when I talk about making things resilient, or I talk about making things decentralized or smaller scale, I'm really kind of talking about all of these systems, not just sort of local flood control, for example.
And it strikes me too, Deb, that when you're talking about these decentralized systems, and you contrast with the centralized, the very top down, the big sort of infrastructural projects, the New Deal and following,
Yeah.
they did a pretty good job in many cases, many classic examples of destroying the social infrastructure of particular places, right? And so I think in some ways what you're describing with sort of decentralized local control infrastructure, right, is perhaps a more organic, symbiotic relationship between our social infrastructure and our physical infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the other thing is that, I've been sort of focusing on the sort of physical systems, right? But again, these are not just technologies, right? These are one of the big differences is that instead of thinking about these as technologies imposed from above, thinking about these systems, understanding them as truly just as much social as they are technical, right? And so that's part of figuring out what makes the most sense for each community. I think it's definitely we're in this period of transition where we're all thinking about it pretty hard for the next, few decades at least, if all goes well. And of course, much, much longer than that if things go badly. But this idea that we are now sort of engaging with these systems and in their so truly social sense, right? To figure out how do we want them to work? And the idea that they're just, externally imposed. Here, actually, so here, let me give you a very specific example, actually, to sort of contextualize this. So we also, of course, have a whole host of new technologies at our disposal. And so that includes things like sensors, that includes things like networks, but it also includes things like communications tools.
Mhm.
So a few years ago, California was headed towards the most energy that they've, or most electricity demand that they've ever had in a day. It was like a super hot day in early September, and people were kind of watching the grid because they were like, okay, like the forecast is that the demand today is going to be higher than it's ever been before for electricity. And so like every source of electricity that they could bring online was kind of brought, online, ready to be sort of brought to bear. And I was following this from my desk in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so 3,000 miles away. And I could see, as the afternoon ticked on, I could see the energy demand ticking up and ticking up and ticking up. And then there was this really sharp, sudden drop in the demand.
Mm.
And it's like, what the hell has happened? And it turns out that text message had been sent to everyone living in the area saying, okay, now is the moment that if there's any electrical appliances or anything that's being used that you could turn off or turn down, now is the moment that we're going to ask you to do that because it will actually keep us from going into a blackout or brownouts. And, I think I want to say it took the equivalent of like a medium-sized city's worth of electricity off the grid at that moment because people were sort of asked to do it like, okay, like now is the moment and it'll make a difference. So that's a kind of a large scale example, but that would of course not have been possible, I think even 5 years ago, much less 10 or 20, right? The model for how we deal with electricity is always you look at what the demand is and you figure out how to supply that demand, right? A bunch of people in a control room. But now we are starting to understand that we have new possibilities for working with our neighbors, for working with each other, for coordinating with each other about how we use and in fact how we think about these systems. But the way it's going to manifest, I think it's going to be in I mean, I mentioned so 55,000 grants. I think there's going to be thousands of different ways in which it shows up, right? That's the sort of transition that we're going through now.
Yeah.
That there's not going to be one, oh, this is how it works. There's going to be sort of any number of places and any number of ways in which you find ways to coordinate together to make these changes.
Let's shift, if we could, to talk a little bit about care and caregiving in a little bit more detail. In your book, you say, but our sustained and sustaining systems are widely considered unglamorous and boring. There is no efficiency in childcare. There is very little scalability in nursing. Dental cleaning or cardiac surgery or pulling espresso shots or replacing tires takes about the same amount of a skilled worker's time year on year. And then you go on in the same paragraph to talk about your former colleague, Gil Pratt, responding to a reporter who asked him about designing robots to take care of his children so he could concentrate on his work. And he responded that the reporter had it exactly backward, that he wanted to design robots to do his work so he could spend more time with his children. So, how should we be thinking about the infrastructure of care at a moment where our colleagues at the think tank Demos Helsinki, they're talking about a new logic of care, a care transition? Here in the United States, we hear a lot about a child care crisis. My impression is we tend to think that we just need more funding for the infrastructure that currently exists. Is that the right way to be thinking about this, or are there other possibilities we haven't considered?
I feel like I'm the person with less expertise on this topic, but let me see if I can think about the connections between
Please, yeah.
the sort of care focused stuff and the infrastructure focused stuff. So the first thing is that our infrastructural systems replace an enormous amount of labor, right? And one of the things that I like to sort of remind people of is that most people in the world who look like me, middle-aged brown woman, right? They spend most of their time getting either fuel for cooking or getting clean water for their families. It literally is the occupation of a large fraction of the planet. And it's the thing that I spend none of my time, broadly speaking, doing, right? I mean, I get fuel for cooking by turning a knob. I get clean water by turning a tap, right? And neither of those really have to do with my individual wealth. It has to do with the fact that I'm embedded in these systems. So, one of the first things is that without functioning systems to provide for survival needs, right? All of that time and care and attention has to come from somewhere. And anyone who's ever dealt with a power failure or dealt with, their water supply being out understands that those are sort of non-negotiable things that you then need to step in and deal with. So that, much like, Gil Pratt said, I want the robots to do the work so I can take care of my kids. It's like, I want infrastructural systems to deliver the water, right? So that I can hang out with my nieces and nephews. So that's kind of the first, obvious point of intersection, right? Everything that we talk about when we talk about care, like elder care or child care or infrastructure for care, is all predicated on functioning infrastructural networks that provide for our basic survival needs, that those are met, and that gives us the bandwidth to do all of the things that are kind of individual. So that's, I think, the key place in where these things intersect. And then it kind of goes off in kind of two directions, right? So one is that means understanding that building, maintaining, updating all those things with these systems is part of care, right? Is that it basically means that anything that we want to do with other people is not going to happen unless these systems are taken care of. So that's the sort of first branch, right? Is actually recognizing that care of these systems, that the maintenance of them, all of the really boring work that is just kind of nice middle class jobs for a lot of people, but isn't, nobody's making, a shareholder profit off of it. No one is going to ribbon cutting ceremonies, right? All of the care of these systems needs to happen. And then, of course, the flip side of that is that to the extent that these systems are not resilient, that they're going to be impacted by climate change, that will impact our ability to take care of each other, right? Because it means that we will be dealing with the sort of basic consequences of making sure we have these survival needs met. So there's kind of two directions in which it makes sense to think about the infrastructural systems that meet survival needs in particular as sort of the baseline for the rest of our care systems. And then we start getting into okay, how do we support human care, right? How do we support caregivers taking care of each other? And that is the thing that I think that policy people and think tanks at all levels are sort of working really hard on. So, it's funny you mentioned the essay I wrote for The Atlantic a few years ago on gratitude for invisible systems, but a couple of years prior to that, I wrote an essay where I argued that we overvalue making in our culture and we undervalue care, and that we undervalue all the things that don't make, that you can't put in a box and make a profit on. And that is the thing that infrastructure and caregiving both have in common, is that they both ultimately should be seen as investments in each other, and that are public goods that aren't, you don't do them because you're going to have a return on investment that can be measured in dollars or shareholder value or even necessarily economic growth, right? That you do them because these are part of what it means to be human and how we take care of each other. And so building a bridge is a thing that someone will make, someone might make money off of, or you see it as an investment, but maintaining the bridge is the sort of active care that is just, it's just going to cost you money, right? It's just a thing that will benefit lots of people in ways that are hard to measure, but will clearly benefit them. And caregiving is much the same thing, right? That investing into caregiving is not a thing that's like you're ever going to make a profit on. And there's always going to be kind of a moral hazard to skip out on it, because it's like, well, how do we spend as little money as possible? But ultimately maintaining a bridge and caring for each other in the more traditional sort of care ways are very similar. And it's a recognition that these things have enormous value to us and our society, that can be measured as positive but non-monetary externalities, to sort of borrow some language from economists. And we all, I realize that I'm sort of preaching to the converted here, and we all kind of know that the value of these things are absolutely not measured in dollars, right? And historically, we haven't even paid for them, right? It's just like we are doing all this work and it's not recognized. And I don't think the answer is to put a dollar value on labor, especially gendered labor. I think the answer is to do a better job as a society of recognizing that there's an enormous number of things that are worth doing because they are care. And in fact, expanding the number of things that we consider to be care, including things like maintaining bridges, that we invest in for the good of our society rather than because, we're gonna have an economic benefit to them.
Underlying that, there needs to
Mhm.
be a revolution of value,
Yeah.
right? Because where we are all sort of autonomous, self-maximizing, profit-hungry
Right.
individuals,
But
right?
we're not, right? We all, I mean, that's the thing. It's like you say it's a revolution. It's like I actually just think we need to allow us to surface publicly all of the stuff that we already know. Most people do not take care of their children because they think it's going to be a positive return on investment, right? You
Right,
know,
right,
we do not sort of work, we don't go to church, we don't go to hang out with our friends because it's like it's an investment. And in fact, we recognize, we sort of can recognize people who are being instrumental, right? It's like,
right,
oh,
right.
we're acutely aware of the, oh, well, they just want to hang out with me because they think they're going to get something from it versus the because they actually want to be with me. This is deeply embedded in all of our lives. Like we don't need a revolution. Like we as
Right,
individuals don't need to think a different way about it. We just need to actually bring that into our sort of public sphere, right? That
right, right.
that to surface the things we already know that our lives and our society has value in how we take care of each other and how we take care of things that isn't necessarily measured in dollars and it certainly isn't measured in ROI.
And what you just said is absolutely, I think, right, that when we take care of our own kids, we're not thinking about the return on investment. And yet we've spent 20 to 30 to 50 years now in seeking federal investment in childcare, for example, by making an argument from return on investment, right? And the personal, the individual, how we relate to our own children, how we think about care to our own children, extrapolated to public policy and systems, they don't match up, and in fact they may even be contradictory.
Well, and particularly since a lot of that goes through basically individual care for children, right? Like it's like I look at policy and I see things like, oh, you'll get tax credit for childcare. What I don't see is investing in, free pre-K, investing in, and in fact, many other countries in the world, have much better support for caring done as a collective endeavor, right? Rather than caring as a thing that is the responsibility of individual atomized households.
Right.
I'm saying this as I'm not a parent and I don't have kids. And so it does mean that I don't have to think about like the practical realities of how are my kids gonna get taken care of, right? I can definitely I have the luxury of thinking about things on the sort of larger scale. But I am an educator. I'm a professor at college, so I work with young people every day and I take care of other people's kids every day, right? That's like literally my job in a very specific way, which is to help them grow and develop as emerging technologists. So I think the policy piece, there's it's not I don't think it's ever like everything else, like all policy pieces, right? It's a question of not how much money are we spending, but what are we spending the money on? And a piece of that is the sort of model of, well, you're only responsible for your own kids, and your job is to sort of maximize what's available for them versus the like we have a collective responsibility for all of our kids and all of our elders, right? And all of the people in our society who are not like autonomous self-acting economic agents because among other things that was all of us for the first 10, 15, possibly longer years of our lives. It will be all of us if all goes well for a decade or more toward the end of our lives, and it can happen to us at any time in between, right? That if we have a health crisis, thinking of it as a collective endeavor only makes sense because it genuinely is a collective endeavor. I don't think most people are just thinking about the well-being of the people nearest to them. We actually understand that we are happy to invest in the well-being of people around us much more broadly.
Yeah. We're almost out of time, and I want to ask you just one more question, Deb, and this is about the critical role that institutions play in our society, but specifically in supporting infrastructure and frankly as infrastructure. Another favorite recent book of mine is Yuval Levin's A Time to Build, right? Where he essentially argues that we're in an institutional crisis, that the metaphors in particular that are used from draining the swamp and everything else are destructive metaphors. But it strikes me, and I think it's clear from Yuval's book, that institutions and institution building and the care and maintenance of institutions is really essential, not only for the types of things that we're talking about in terms of how we care for one another, but sort of articulating the direction in which we're heading as a society, right? And so I'd like for you to just, if you could, reflect on this relationship between institutions and the health of our institutions, whether it's churches or colleges, universities, and so forth, and infrastructure and how infrastructure works.
Titi Nguyen, who's a philosopher at the University of Utah, he's written a bunch about the fact that trust is transitive and that it needs to be transitive. So basically it's like we live in an incredibly complex world and we can't possibly understand everything that we need to understand to make decisions. So that means that we have to kind of trust that other people are telling us true things, and in particular that institutions are telling us true things, right? And this is why it has so much power to say, well, a Harvard professor says, right? Because it's basically highlighting that element of like, you should trust that person. It's also why that can be used as a weapon, right? To say like that these people who you should be trusting, you should not trust. And so it's been used as a way of weakening institutions. So I mean, I think this is a genuinely hard question, right? To basically that I think that it is important to have institutions because of this point that Nguyen raised about the transition of trust, right? That the transitive nature of trust, that we can't possibly wrap our heads around everything. And this in the article that you cited, the 2017 Gratitude in Visible Systems, that's a huge piece of it, right? None of us can individually, monitor like the food, how safe is not just our eggs, but our milk and everything else in our kitchen, right? None of us can manage the safety of our, the plane we're on. We do have to trust institutions. So that is like a genuinely hard question, right? It's like, how do we establish and build and grow this trust? And I'm not sure I have good answers to it, although I think one piece is definitely being aware of the fact that this is a problem, right? That institutions have trust and that they have sort of social trust to do things. The second piece, though, is a little bit possibly even more abstract, which is there aren't that many institutions in the world that are thinking sufficiently long term, that are thinking essentially in perpetuity, right? And that's kind of, in a way, how we got to where we are. And so, I feel like, colleges, churches, some nations, Finland's actually a good example, they're building a nuclear repository for nuclear waste. And they're definitely like, people will be living here in the thousands of years, and we don't know who they're going to be, but we are responsible for those people. And so the other real role that I think that institutions can play is to really help us think and understand that we are in a long-term relationship with each other and where we live. And some of that, a significant amount of that is mediated through infrastructure. So if we build these systems and we think they're still going to exist in 100 years, that means that the people who live here will be affected by those systems. Now, I won't be here. My kids won't be here, right? My non-existent kids won't be here. But we are setting conditions for those folks. So the one important role, like that one important intersection of sort of institutions and infrastructure and care, is to sort of raise the banner for thinking in this sort of long term and thinking about the world that we might want to build, thinking about the people who will live where we live, because surely there will be humans living where we live in 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years even. So institutions that are thinking beyond the span of a human lifetime, that are really designed to think beyond the span of a human lifetime, have an important role to play in helping us to sort of navigate to that perspective and to build that. And I think that's possibly even more true when we're all sort of facing the sort of buffeting of immediate, you need to react to this change, having some guidance for thinking in the longer term about the people around us that are not around us today, but will be around where we are in some long period of time. So with, I had a significant hand in building the institution where I work, because I'm at a new engineering college and I started as an early faculty member. But I know, I think the question of how to do it broadly is one that many, many people are grappling. And again, I'm not sure there's like a one size fits all solution, but I agree with you that because of both the issue of transitive trust and the issue of fostering long-term thinking, I think institutions do have a really valuable role to play.
Right. I mean, I would say that in a lot of what I'm really interested in is that in a lot of cases we have institutions. The institutions do not need to be built. Harvard, for example, is an old institution.
Yeah.
The United States Congress is a relatively at least on paper, a relatively powerful institution. There's something about sort of cultivating the type of people, the type of habit with the habits and the practices and the virtues of long-term thinking that command the trust of the people that needs to be considered in addition to the strength of the institutions themselves.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's going to be a little bit more, for lack of a better word, networked, right? Rather than hierarchical,
Yeah.
right? I don't think we're ever going to go back to the world where like the Encyclopedia Britannica was like the true source of knowledge, right?
Right.
And I'm okay with that, right? Like there's like so much stuff that was never really, brought to the fore in things like Encyclopedia Britannica. Yeah. I definitely think of, the enormous amount of history of colonization of much of the world, and I feel like was not, Encyclopedia Britannica in particular did not capture that very well. So I don't think we're going to be able to go back to the world where we have like a small number of institutions where we invest all our trust, but having a network of sort of institutions where we have trust invested so that we can actually do things that are more complicated for us than we can do as individuals.
Yeah.
Is definitely important. It's counterbalancing corporations, if nothing else, right?
Yeah.
Having ones that have missions that are different than shareholder value or different than making a profit, but are genuinely have long-term thinking. But the shape those will take, I think, is still emerging.
Thank you so much. The book is How Infrastructure Works, published last year. And we're so glad to have you on this Capita In Conversation podcast. Grateful for your time. This has been a fascinating conversation. I wish it could go on much longer, but maybe we can have you back for a part 2 sometime in the future.
Great. Thanks for having me on.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Each episode of Capita In Conversation is produced by Michael Bettis and is available by podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as capita.org.